Thank you and good morning, and thank you for attending the webinar today. Again, my name is Rich Herman. I'm the Director of Product at oseberg. I've got about now 31 years of experience in the industry, which is starting to sound like a very long time. Must mean I am actually getting old. I'm a geophysicist by background. I've spent the last probably 20 years in various product management positions, and I've worked for some large and some small companies, but many of the information providers over the last several years, including P2 and TGS, IHS, Drilling Info, but happy to be here at oseberg, where I've been heading up the product team over the last couple of years. You can get me via email at rich.oseberg.io, and I'll put that up also again at the end of the presentation. Just a little bit about oseberg. These days, I like to describe us really as an oil and gas data extraction company, as opposed to just a data company. We're getting quite good at extracting and transforming data. We deliver that data through a set of software and different types of web services, some of which you'll see today. And have recently started up a consulting business where we're actually working with customers with their data. The company is headquartered in Oklahoma City. I'm actually based here in Denver, which is where I'm speaking to you from today. And our customers tend to be primarily upstream and midstream companies, and they use our products to look at industry trends, competitive intelligence, new drilling and A&D opportunities, and hopefully, as you'll see today, maybe the opportunities to find some open acreage, even in some places that are traditionally thought as fairly crowded. As I mentioned, the data extraction part of our business, we're getting quite adept at applying artificial intelligence and machine learning, in particular natural language processing, to extract attributes from unstructured data. So that includes county lease records, state regulatory documents, and we transform that data that's generally almost always unstructured and non-standard to make it searchable. It can also be analyzed and put into GIS applications. And as I mentioned before, we're starting to work now with client proprietary data as well. So that's a little bit about oseberg. Let's dive into today's problem, which is really an open acreage problem. And the question is, in perhaps the hottest play in the world right now, how do you find a way in if you were late to the party? And we often hear these two things from clients. One, there's nothing open in the Permian, but we also hear number two, which was that we struggle to meet drilling obligations, and that could be due to financial constraints. It could be rig availability. A lot of times it's just lack of full visibility into the lease obligations, particularly after an acquisition or a merger situation, especially on non-core properties. So the question is, if number two is true, and people keep telling us that it is, then can number one also be true? And the reality is it's really not. But you really need to know where to look, and you need to look fast. These windows of opportunity don't stay open very long. A lot of times people are aware that they have to meet a drilling obligation, and for some external reason they're having trouble do it. It's not that they're not paying attention, they just can't maybe get a rig in there and get that well down. So these windows of opportunities don't stay open for long, but they're actually happening constantly. So how to find the needles in the haystack? What we're going to show today is a way to look for pewed out leases pretty much everywhere in the Texas Permian, and we'll get to that in a second. We'll show how to construct these potentially severing or severed acreage using a set of rolling time windows. Again, as I mentioned, it's a limited time of opportunity that you can look for these tracts that are potentially available. So we're going to create a set of rolling time windows so that you can look at months before and after the lease's primary term. So you can kind of see what may be expiring soon and what have expired recently. We're also going to check to see if there's any recent permitting or completion activity, because it may turn out that there is a well going down there, or somebody is paying attention and trying to get a well drilled. So we want to be able to compare the acreage to wellbore information. We do a couple other things that are kind of specific to the Permian, which is we like to try to eliminate state of Texas university lands just because they can show up as false positives based on our calculations, but in reality there generally is not a situation where the acreage can pew out. There's some other things we do. Probably don't want to reveal all the secret sauce today, but we do a couple other things as well just to validate and clean up the tracks that we're identifying. And then we publish these, as I mentioned earlier, really through a web service, in this case, a spatial map service. So we're utilizing an ArcGIS service from ESRI, which I assume many or most of you are familiar with, so that you can access this information from just about anywhere. And we also provide access to the lease information as well, which is a core data set for oseberg. So about that Pughed clause, I'm assuming that most people attending this webinar are probably familiar with the Pughed clause, but it's an important element of what we're developing here as far as identifying leases that could be prospective to be open. And so in general, a Pughed clause is a legal provision that's introduced in a lease that really limits the rights of the lessee to hold all of the areas, all the acreage, or the depths of leased property if their drilling or production obligations are not being met. These were introduced back in the 40s to protect lessors from a lessee holding an undue amount of acreage and not really drilling enough wells to drain the property. And there's two primary types of Pughed clauses. There's probably, seems like, an infinite permutation of language that's used to describe these, but you can split them into two main categories. One is called a vertical Pugh, or sometimes referred to as an acreage or a surface Pugh. And that really refers to the portion of land that's located outside of a production unit, such that the lands that are outside of a producing unit boundary at the end of the primary term cannot be retained by virtue of only production inside the unit. So if we've drilled a well here, if you look over here in the upper right, and we're holding a certain amount of acreage of that well, if the original lease entailed all of what's in the light green here, if you don't drill another well here to the northwest of this well, you don't get to hold that acreage. And really, in the other dimension is called a horizontal Pugh or a depth Pugh, and this refers to actually holding specific producing intervals in the subsurface. And these are frequently defined relative to absolute depths from the surface or some combination of geologic markers. For today's discussion, we're only going to concern ourselves with vertical Pughs. I'll mention depth Pughs briefly later, but we're not going to worry about that scenario today. It's quite complex, and we're going to limit today's investigations just to basically acreage or surface Pughed clauses. So how are we finding those Pughed clauses? One of the things I mentioned earlier is we are applying machine learning and NLP techniques to teach computers basically to read and interpret leases. So for the last several years, we started using pretty much human entry at first. We would use an application where an operator could read a lease provision, for example, in a PDF, and they could highlight it, and they could actually enter the various types of data into a database, including whether there is a Pughed clause or not. We also look for other types of legal clauses that can be in leases, including pooling clauses, cessation clauses, continuous drilling. I draw your attention down here to the bottom right. What's interesting here is you can see the annotator, the operator in this case, is labeled prediction. So this is a case where the computer, based on learning models that we've trained over the last couple of years, has essentially been able to read this lease and determine that in fact there is a Pughed clause present in the lease. And this is how we're starting to do this now at scale. These training models have been trained over the last couple of years, and we're getting quite good now at essentially just letting a computer look at a lease document, essentially read it on the fly, and create all the various attributes that need to be extracted from that lease. And that's how we're essentially processing now attributes and information and clauses from literally millions of oil and gas leases. The other important ingredient that goes into the Pughed Out Acreage computation are what we call our Texas units. And there are many, many different types of units, and a full discussion of all the different types of definitions in units in Texas is going to be beyond the scope of today's webinar. But for today's purposes, we're going to be looking at what we call lease units or pooled units. And the outlines of these units can fortunately be found on the Railroad Commission W1 well permit applications. And there's kind of an example of that over on the right. What we're doing is we're actually digitizing, in this case, all of the W1 permits from about 15 counties in the Permian. And we do that really for any well that's been producing since 2010. So we go back about 10 years, and we actually find each and every plat, and we digitize essentially what is the lease unit, or if it's a pooled unit, the pooled boundary, and create a spatial polygon for that particular unit. One of the things we're careful to do is we update that unit with all new W1 plats. So as a lease is being developed and there's multiple wells being drilled onto that lease, as a new W1 is filed, we do not create a new separate polygon for that well. We're always looking at what the existing unit was prior to the drilling of that well, and then we amend and update that unit boundary to accommodate the additional well that's been drilled. We also update the operator of that unit using Railroad Commission transfer data, but we're not going to utilize that today. But it's another thing that oseberg does specifically around our units data set. So by virtue of the updates, our units reflect the most current earned acreage, so to speak, within the original lease. And so the magic calculation for us here is to look at the difference between the original lease outline. And we map the original lease outline by extracting the legal description, as I showed in the prior slide. In this case, again, we could be using a machine learning extraction to pull the legal description out of the lease. We put that through an auto mapping algorithm and actually create a polygon to represent the original lease boundary. And then we compare that to essentially what the current unit boundary is. The current unit boundary more or less represents all of the earned acreage of that lease up to the primary term. And when we look at the difference between those two, that's how we start to identify acreage that is potentially pewed out in a vertical or acreage sense. So a real simple example, we could apply any unit here. Let's assume for a moment it's a 640 acre lease. And let's say we can drill 4 wells at 160 acre spacing. We drill our first well down to the southeast, and essentially there's a unit that's defined for that well. It's provided in the W1 permit for that well. We digitize that unit boundary. A second well is drilled. Now the unit boundary is going to include both of those wells. We drill a third well. The unit boundary again gets updated to now include all 3 wells. And if that's all that's been drilled at the end of the primary term, then this northeast quarter, this 160 acre parcel, is potentially going to pew out. Because in this case, the lessee has not drilled enough wells to fulfill the spacing obligations on this lease. And this 160 acre parcel could potentially be pewing out and available for lease by another party. So this is kind of a simplistic example, but it gives you a good idea of what we're doing in the basic computation. So how do we get the lease units again from the W1? This is an example of our units data. This is a shell unit here. This is an example of the W1. It's a little bit hard to see that hatchet pattern, but we essentially outline and digitize the W1 plat, and that's what's used to create the polygon that goes into our map layer for that particular unit. So again, our pewed out acreage workflow here is essentially we're going to start with our leases, and there's lots of leases in this case. We're going to filter them by whether there is a pew clause or not. We are going to filter and create various time intervals by expiration date, so we can basically bracket the expiration windows. We're going to add our units data. You can see here in the case where we have units overlying leases, we know that there's production holding that portion of the lease. And now we're going to construct basically new polygons based on what would be a unitless lease, so to speak. We'll look and see if there's completions. We always look to see if there's a recent completion. If we're looking at this particular block in the center here, you notice there was one completion on the block, but it's back from 1980. And since there's no unit here, we're assuming that there's no recent production, but we've checked just to make sure. We'll also look and see if there's a recent permit. We also see a permit here that correlates to that older completion. So there's no recent permitting activity here. There is an original lease, there is no unit. So potentially this is a potential now pewed out acreage block. And so we do this basically en masse over 15 counties across all those different time horizons and create a set of polygons. So before I get into the demo here, just maybe some disclaimers and a quick discussion of potential false positives. First of all, This is still in beta, so you all know what that means. This was never intended to be perfect. There's not a perfect way with one easy button just to absolutely ensure to show what's open and what's not. But the purpose of what we're doing here is to get us all to the red zone faster, right? Let's get to the 10-yard line, maybe the 5-yard line, and we can do this continuously. So it's one way of looking at scale across hundreds of thousands of leases of what could potentially be pewing out or what has recently pewed out, and give you easy access to the additional information that you need to go in and determine whether it's truly open or not. Again, just a reminder, we're only talking here about vertical or acreage pews. We do have a bit of a blind spot between the permit and completion, so obviously that could be a span of many months. So it's a blind spot right now that we can't address, but I'll mention it here when we close up. We're not filtering yet for lease extensions, so I'll mention that. In fact, we'll drill into a couple of these, and you'll see where some of the leases do have extension terms, and it's quite possible that the lessee has executed that extension while they haven't drilled and satisfied the obligations on the primary term. They may be paying additional royalties, essentially, or bonuses to extend that lease. We're also having some issues with very long lateral bottom hole completions. So in some cases, we may be getting some false positives because we're not correctly intersecting the bottom hole completion with the lease polygon. We've seen that in a few cases. That's something that we're working on. And we're also not addressing discontiguous tracks right now. So if a lease is being held off production on another track that's miles away from it, we're not making that connection at the moment. And we're also not showing the production as a layer. So I talk a lot about production today. You won't see that as one of the map layers in the demo. Okay, let's jump right into the application. We're going to start really with the answer layer here. If you look over in the legend on the left, you can see where we've assembled these potential pewed out acreage polygons, and they're broken into those various time intervals we discussed. So if you look at the bottom, kind of the cooler colors indicate leases that are expiring within the next 90 to 180 days, 60 to 90, 30 to 60, etc. The hotter colors show leases that have already expired over similar time intervals. If you look at kind of this dark red color, these are leases that expired over a year ago. And what's interesting just to look at that is you can easily see kind of the outline of the Midland Subbasin, part of the Permian, where people have tried to obviously push the play in all directions. In a lot of cases, the acreage has not been as productive or economic, and so those leases have expired. One of the first things that we're going to want to do, just to make the map a little bit simpler, is we're going to want to turn off probably those end members. Most people have told us that if stuff has expired more than a year ago, there may be something else wrong with the lease, or if it's going to expire a year from now, that's a lot of time for someone to address their drilling obligations. So we're going to go ahead and turn off some of the end members here. So let's just try to look for leases that expired maybe 60 to 90 days ago, and that are expiring maybe just within the next 60 to 90 days. And now you can see already kind of the needle in the haystack problem, where we've reduced greatly the number of potential tracks that have expired. What we're looking at here is just a little ESRI web application. These layers that we're looking at here, you could view those at any type of ESRI application. It could be ArcGIS Desktop, it could be ArcGIS Online. Really, any third-party application that can consume an ArcGIS service would be able to incorporate these layers. We're just using a little viewer today to make it easier to demo these layers. So one of the things that I do when I'm looking around for some of these prospective leases is turn a couple other layers on. This is going to get a little busy, but if we turn on the completion data, for example, you start to see right away where there's some concentrated production and completion activity. And it's a little bit easier to see right away where there seem to be some candidates where potentially there is not a completed well. So if we zoom into this guy over here, I'm zooming in on this little green box that you're seeing here, you notice that there are no completions that appeared to be around that acreage. We'll check a couple other things. We'll take a look. We'll turn our units on here. You can see that there's no unit data overlying that block. And then importantly, let's take a look at the permits. So you can see that there's permits all around here, and the blue lines basically represent the directional sticks between the surface and bottom hole location. And you can see clearly there's no wellbore intersection with this block, either from a permit or from a completed well. So at this point, we might view this as a productive or a prospective acreage to take a look at. All of these objects are selectable from within this application. So in this case, I'm going to click on that object, on that acreage polygon there, and I can actually take a look at the lease for that particular block. And so this is where I would look through and start to see if there are certain terms that might extend this. See if there's any other details in here that might tell me that that's actually not a valid lease. But in this case, it looks already like it could be prospective. And so this is basically the way you start to hunt around and look for acreage that potentially could be prospective. Remember that we're doing a lot of computation on the back end. We're actually not including the permits as part of that computation because just because a permit has been filed doesn't mean that a well has been drilled. So we include the completions really as part of the computation underneath the hood, and then we make it easy for you to visualize whether there's a permit that's intersecting that particular acreage block or not. So let's turn the completions and the permits back off here in the units, and we'll kind of zoom back out here. And I'll show you a couple examples of, sometimes when you think things are too good to be true, they possibly are. We're going to use kind of a bookmark function here within the application. And so I'm going to go to a particular area here. This is up in Loving County, and you can see I've got quite a contiguous block of acreage here that doesn't appear to have any completions, doesn't appear to have any permits on it. If I click on one of these leases, it looks like it could be expiring within the next 60 to 90 days. Trying to find something that's that contiguous, it seems unlikely that something like that would be that open. So if we go into this particular lease, for example, we might look to see if there is an extension. And in our data, looking for extensions is actually something that we do pull out of the lease. But just for the purpose of illustration today, you can easily see I can find in this lease there is an extension term. So there's a 2-year extension. So my guess here is that if we went deeper into Oseberg's county records, we would probably find in the county records that this extension has actually been filed. So in this case, this is probably one of the false positives that I talked about. We might look at another one here. This was on Ector County. Same thing. You might find a lease here that looks like it's prospective. In this case, if we take a look at this, and again, we can do a quick search function here. All of our leases are OCR'd, and so it's easy to find a particular term that you're looking for. Let's just see if we can go down the bottom here. Yeah, you can see I look for certain language like extend to look for that extension option. So this is another case where, and I'll mention this later as we start to use this as a toggle, but we'll be able to allow you to filter leases that have extensions on or off. We don't have that running in the demo today, but it's fairly easy to go into the lease information and actually look for that. This shortcut capability is nice. We can easily save, like if we're going through the map and we're looking for a little prospective acreage and we want to come back to it later and do more research on it, the bookmark functionality is nice to do that with. I'll show you just kind of a final example here. I blogged about this a couple weeks ago. This was a parcel out in Glasscock County. This was one that we actually went through. Sorry, let me go right back there. Too quick with the mouse pad. This was acreage that we actually went and had checked out both through an operator in the area, through their land company, and actually contracted a private land broker to go ahead and actually do the work and do the title work here. And indeed, we did find that this particular parcel was open. In fact, about 12.5% of it is owned by Oxy. So we've gone in and we've made sure that we've gone in and actually done some checks on some of these leases all the way through, just to make sure things that looked like they were open to us actually were truly open. At this point, let's just go back. We'll take one more look kind of at a regional level. Let's turn off again some of those end members. We'll turn off our permits. And you can see really at this point over all the Permian, we've got quite a bit of what look like prospective acres. As I mentioned, some of these are false positives, maybe due to extensions. They may actually be a case where we're hitting something that's between the permanent completion. We don't know that there's an actual well there. So if anything, we've probably got a little more false positives here. We're going to continue to tune this. But hopefully this gives you a good idea of how easy it is within this application on a regular and ongoing basis. And I think that's one of the powerful things, is that these layers are being calculated on a rolling basis. So we're always calculating these from the current date and allowing you to see leases that are either expiring in the next few months or potentially have already expired and might still be available. Okay, just to wrap up here, the current coverage for the Pughed Out Acreage computations is in these 15 counties in the Texas Permian Basin. Covers most of the Delaware and Midland basins, as well as much of the Central Platform. These computations are dependent on those unit data sets, and we currently have those units for these 15 counties. So what's next? We'll target the end of beta. Hopefully at the end of this quarter, we'll start updating these layers weekly. We will add that production layer just to make it easier to see where the production data is coming from. We essentially proxy for that using the unit data today, but we'll add that production layer to make it easier for you to see that. We'll fix that bottom hole issue that I talked about earlier. We'll make it easier for you to filter leases by whether there's an extension clause or not, because we do extract that as part of our processing of leases. We just haven't included that functionality in the demo to date, but we'll add that in. We're also interested in looking at continuous drilling or continuous operation clauses. We've had a couple clients ask us to think about calculating layers to look for leases in jeopardy due to continuous drilling operations clauses where potentially someone is not fulfilling those obligations even if they've satisfied the initial PU clause. Try to address that blind spot that we have between the permit data and the completion data. This is a place where I think superimposing active rig locations would help put some more visibility on whether someone's actually getting a well down or not. And then really the more complex problem of extending this down into the depth dimension and looking essentially at horizontal PU clauses and looking to see where we may have leases that are in jeopardy within specific intervals, geologic intervals, where a specific formation may not be completed and producing and create a pewed out situation, but in the depth dimension. We're working on that now on a consulting basis with a couple companies, and we're looking at how we might be able to productize that down the line. And with that, it's really your turn now. Just like thank you for your time today. This may have gone a little bit long. Hopefully you stuck with it, and hopefully it was helpful and informative. Again, my name is Rich Herman. You can reach me at rich@oseberg.io. And thank you again, and I'll be looking forward to trying to answer any questions I can.